A month ago, two of Justin Trudeau's top cabinet ministers were in Beijing discussing trade. Today, that seems like a distant memory. Relations have crumbled ever since December 1st, when, at the request of the United States, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Chinese telecom company Huawei. In the days following, China detained two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and they have yet to be released. Over the weekend, Canada's foreign ministry said that China's foreign ministry, said that it strongly urges Canada to immediately rectify its mistakes and release the detained Chinese citizen. It also said, "We strongly urge the U.S. to revoke the relevant person's arrest warrant immediately." This diplomatic spat has cast a chill over business between Canada and China. Could things get worse? And what should the U.S.'s role be in the days ahead? Gary Locke served as U.S. ambassador to China from 2011 to 2014. Prior to that, he served as President Obama's Commerce Secretary from 2009 to 2011 and as the governor of Washington State from 1997 to 2005. Ambassador Locke joins me now from Seattle. Hi, Ambassador. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time.
Good to be with you.
This all began with the arrest of Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver. Now China's detained two Canadian citizens. We had former Canadian ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, on the show last week, and he said in his mind the two events are definitely linked, that there are, quote, no coincidences in China. Do you agree with that?
I have to agree. The timing is so unusual, out of the ordinary. You have to believe that it is timed, it is linked to the arrest of the CFO of Huawei.
Does the scale of China's response, the idea that they detained two citizens, surprise you?
No, not at all. There have been so many instances of foreign citizens being detained by the Chinese because of allegations or complaints by business rivals against U.S. companies or foreign companies. And so it's not unusual that they detain people or they detain the children of people who are under investigation, of foreign nationals that they want brought back to China. So this is very typical of China. It's a way of sending a message to either the family members that are wanted in China or to the governments of other countries.
Given that the extradition hearing for Ms. Meng is still a little while away, and the decision on that extradition is still months away, perhaps, do you think that the message that they will send will continue to increase in severity? Do you think there's more to come, basically?
No, I don't think that there's more to come. I think there will be a pause until they see what happens in that extradition hearing. Will Canada extradite the CFO to the United States? And of course, it really puts Canada in a very difficult predicament because law enforcement between the United States and Canada have long had a history of good cooperation, apolitical, non-political. But of course, the charges against the CFO of Huawei right now comes at a very difficult political moment during these very tense and delicate trade talks and trade friction between the United States and China. So Canada's kind of caught in the middle, unfortunately.
Let me ask you about the U.S.'s role here. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last week characterized the detention of those Canadians as unacceptable and said they should be returned. Do you see a role for the American government? Should they, for example, be intervening? Or based on your time in China as ambassador, do you think that, in that role, you would have had some sort of, you would have been taking some action in the background?
Well, I think all the various ambassadors from foreign countries, especially from North America and some of the EU countries, would have been united in supporting Canada's demands that the Canadian citizens be released, that they should not be caught in the middle, and that Canada is simply following international law in terms of law enforcement cooperation with the United States and other countries, and that the issues must be delinked. Certainly, the United States needs to be very careful in terms of how it's going to approach future efforts to sanction countries and companies that do business with Iran, especially in light of the fact that the United States has pulled out of the Iran Accord, is imposing sanctions on Iran, and yet you have many other countries around the world, and especially in the EU, that want to uphold that Iran Accord, and China, of course, was one of those. And so it's putting a lot of companies, and therefore the executives of these companies from all around the world, in a very difficult position with respect to U.S. actions. Will they be subject to indictments, criminal prosecution for doing trade with Iran in accordance with the Iran Accord, even though the United States is imposing sanctions on Iran and therefore companies that do business with Iran. That's going to be a very difficult issue going forward. Now, of course, the arrest of the CFO related to sanctions against Iran before the Iranian Accord, and that's very problematic. We're going to have to sort that out. We're going to have to let that proceed and find out what the facts are. But what will happen going forward?
Just to pick up on the first part of your answer there, if the U.S. is among a number of countries, let's say, that among Canada's allies that try to up the pressure on China and get across that message that you described, do you think it will work?
Well, it really depends on what's happening with the trade negotiations. And, the President Trump has indicated that he's willing to get involved, intervene in this case. But that's also sending a very difficult and problematic message to law enforcement. Are we going to let politics intervene with the independence of criminal investigations and law enforcement that have always been distant and separated between the Justice Department and the White House? I mean, the criminal prosecutors and district U.S. attorneys all across the country are supposed to be acting independently, and we have a rule of law. And one of the things that countries admire about the United States is that politics do not interfere with law enforcement.
Did President Trump undermine Canada's message to China when they're trying to say, that's all that's happening here, we're just following the rule of law?
Yes, it does, because if the United States is simply working on past agreements and carrying out past agreements in cooperation with the United States, and the cooperation between the two countries goes both ways, it's always been viewed as independent, above board, and separate from politics. And so if the president is intervening, then the Chinese will say, okay, Canada, why don't you intervene? Why don't you just simply refuse to extradite this person to the United States?
Does Canada have any hope of convincing China otherwise?
I think obviously the Canadian officials are talking with the Chinese and trying to impress upon them that they were simply following long-standing cooperation agreements with the United States. The United States had the indictment. They notified the Canadian authorities when the CFO was about to set foot in Canada, and they said they wanted her arrested. They had legitimate charges against her. Canada does not try to go into the merits of the case and simply follow the agreements that they have, long-standing agreements between the two countries, and arresting the person on behalf of the United States. That is all now thrown into the air with some of the political trade discussions and talk that's going on, and the statements by the president. So it puts Canada in a little bit more difficult position.
This whole affair, Ambassador, has brought renewed scrutiny to the telecom giant Huawei, to the company Huawei. The U.S. has long warned of national security concerns about that company. In fact, while you were Commerce Secretary, I believe there were 2 Huawei deals that were scuttled after national security concerns were raised. What are your concerns about this company?
Well, obviously, the United States intelligence agencies have some concerns. Those are all classified. That's all classified information. But the concern that the U.S. government has is that, or at least the intelligence agencies have, and it's now being shared with other Western countries, and Western countries are also following suit and denying Huawei, or at least curbing the purchase of Huawei telecommunications equipment for their national telecommunications networks. And the fear is that somehow Huawei, with its close ties to the Chinese government, will have the capability of putting some sort of devices or spying on or collecting information from the people of the countries in which their equipment is installed, or that they can somehow use that equipment to disrupt the normal flow of telecommunications if the Chinese government were to direct them to do so.
Five Eyes spy chiefs have warned our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, of the national security risks associated with the company, the risk you just pointed to. The U.S., Australia, and New Zealand have all banned the company's equipment from its 5G infrastructure. Does Canada, from your perspective, have to follow suit?
Well, that's really a decision that the intelligence officials of Canada will have to make independently, consulting with and the other intelligence agencies of the other countries around the world that have this information. I can't comment on the strength of that information, but it's something that the intelligence agencies and the top political leadership of all Western countries will have to decide among themselves in collaboration with each other upon sharing the information that is available.
Do you think it's possible, though, given the relationship, the intelligence sharing relationship between Five Eyes partners, that some countries could go ahead and others couldn't? What kind of difficulties would that present?
Well, first of all, Huawei is a huge multinational telecommunications company. Not only do they make sophisticated telecommunications equipment that's used for the transmission of wireless and telephonic communications, but they also make cell phones. They make inexpensive cell phones using Western technology, whether it's chips or glass and things like that. And it's distributed and made available to people all around the world. And they're low-cost phones and very popular among people that are not looking for the most expensive Samsung and iPhone devices, but something very practical, very affordable. So they have a big range of business, but one of their core pieces of business is in the sophisticated telecommunications gear that goes into the wireless operations and basic telecommunications infrastructure of America and countries all around the world. And those are the type of devices, equipment that our national security people have concerns about.
And I guess I wonder, though, if certain countries among the Five Eyes were to go ahead with that kind of infrastructure that you're talking about, would that put into jeopardy the intelligence sharing relationships that exist right now?
No, I don't think it would jeopardize the intelligence sharing. Each country, of course, has to make its own independent judgment as to whether or not the equipment poses a security risk to their own country's telecommunications infrastructure. And that's an independent assessment. But obviously, the information sharing will continue, and it's been proven very useful, both to the United States as well as to the other countries in which we cooperate.
Before I let you go, Ambassador, Huawei CFO, as we said, still awaits potential extradition to the U.S. In the meantime, do you think there's anything or any way for the U.S., Canada, and China to bring down the temperature, or does it get worse before it gets better?
Well, clearly we need to make sure that there is an agreement, a trade agreement between the United States and China. That's the long-standing issues that American companies, the American government, but also foreign companies and foreign governments have about the trade investment policies of China, the lack of a level playing field, the forced transfer of technology by foreign firms to their Chinese partners. And a lot of it stems from the fact that, first of all, so many sectors of the Chinese economy are off limits to foreign investment. And in those areas where investment is allowed, oftentimes the foreign investment has to be less than 50%, which means you have to have a Chinese partner. And in very sophisticated technology fields, it means you have to share your technology with that partner. And that's of deep concern to foreign companies, that forced transfer of technology. So that's the real nub of these trade negotiations and the friction. And that's what we need to make sure is resolved, and not just for the benefit of America, but for Canadian companies and companies all around the world. And I think if we can lower the trade friction between China and Western countries and Western companies, that will go a long ways towards solving this current dilemma.
Just to be clear, is the only way or the most concrete way to lower that friction an actual deal, or can it be more ambiguous than that? Or is a deal specifically necessary?
Well, I think a deal is necessary, and there has to be clear parameters of and expectations and measurements of what each side will do, so that each side can be held accountable.
All right.
We just can't have vague promises and assurance that things will improve over the long term. We've heard that before. Progress has been very slow or non-existent, and so I think both sides are going to demand and need identifiable, measurable specifics.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador Locke.
Thank you.